Welcome to the Special Education Essentials for Parents and Families podcast with your host, David Tollner. In each episode, we'll have guests who are professionals in the special education and disability services industry who support children with special needs. The law is complex, and this podcast does not cover all situations, legal responsibilities, or variations in different circumstances. This podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only, and nothing contained in this podcast should be construed as legal advice. The views expressed in this podcast may not be those of the host or the firm. We are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast. This podcast is not intended to replace legal advice. You can find this show on all the major platforms including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and on our website, TollnerLawOffices.com. Now, here's the host of Special Education Essentials for Parents and Families, David Tollner.
Yes, welcome everyone to another episode of Special Education Essentials. I am your host, David Tollner. I'm very pleased today to introduce you to our guest, Dr. Brendan Pratt. He's a licensed psychologist who works with and assesses children with learning challenges. But before I get into formally inviting him on, I'd like to set the stage, I think, for why he's so important and relevant to what we're talking about, right? The whole point of this podcast being knowing your rights and creating a better IEP for your child. And if you have been following this podcast from the beginning, I spent the first three podcasts sort of outlining the 10 rules, if you will, to improve your child's IEP. Number 8 rule is bring an expert. And as I talked about there, right, you're only seen, unfortunately, in the law as a parent, even though nobody knows your child better in many cases. When it comes to IEPs and getting something important out of that process, it sometimes is very helpful to bring an expert such as Dr. Pratt, somebody who knows your child, has assessed them, and can come to the IEP meeting and talk about what your child needs and what they're struggling with in terms of a learning disability. So somebody like him, a licensed psychologist, and particularly him, can be critical to a good outcome for your child on his or her IEP. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Dr. Pratt. Welcome, Dr. Pratt. Nice to have you on our show.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, I'm going to start with the question I start with every time, which is, why are you here? And by that, I mean, why did you get into this as a profession? And what is it that you do? What is your service that you provide to children with learning disabilities?
You know, I actually got into it because my mom was a teacher and a resource specialist, and because I'm dyslexic. So I kind of saw things from both sides. I saw, all the effort that my mom put in helping children that had special needs, and then some of the struggles that I had early on learning to read and write. And between those two, I always wanted to work with children, and this seemed like a really good way to help support children and families.
And so tell us, what is it that you do? How do you support them?
Primarily, there's two things I do. One is working with the actual child, and that is, testing. So testing their intelligence, their academic achievement, attention, depression, anxiety, memory, so forth. So that's the testing part of it. But I also do a lot of research because I end up reviewing, hundreds or thousands of pages of records, listening to recordings of IEP meetings, and just trying to piece together the puzzle of what's happened for this child, what their needs are, what's been tried so far, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and then going to the IEP meeting and putting that all together and trying to help the team better understand the child's needs through informing it through the testing and through the history. So both of those are critical, because if you just see the child in testing, you just have one snapshot, and you don't want to you don't want to suggest a bunch of things that have already been tried over and over and haven't worked. So.
Right. And so why would a parent find you to be an important piece of their team, right? What do you bring to the table, let's say, that a school psychologist doesn't bring, who might have done similar testing in the past?
Well, I mean, so for the parents, I think a lot of it is, I mean, I tend to be very obsessive and thorough. So, so I, they can trust that I'm going to look at all the documents, that I'm going to listen to all the recordings, that I'm going to really carefully figure out what's going on. School psychologists can be excellent, and many of their reports are really helpful and accurate and so on. But they also just have one snapshot of the child, and so. And they have a lot of pressures that I don't have. They have time pressures because they've got a whole slew of kids that they need to evaluate. And in a school setting, they don't always have the luxury of time to be able to, look at each individual child. And then the other part of it is that they have kind of institutional pressures, because they want to help the child, but they also have kind of a gatekeeping role. They can't provide every service to every child, so they need to kind of make different trade-offs. And so what I offer parents is kind of an objective, independent view of things. Basically, if this were my child, he or she had exactly these issues, then what type of support would I be asking for, and what's appropriate? And parents can go in either direction. Sometimes they're asking for way too little, and their child really needs a lot more support than they're getting. And sometimes they're asking for way too much. I have parents where it's a 5-year-old and they want a one-to-one aid to help them with reading, and it's like, wait a minute, let's slow down a little bit. So I can so one of the big, even though they know their child better than anybody else, they haven't been through this over and over. They don't know what's really typical for a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, and so forth. So I can give more of that context in terms of the norms for the test, but also just the 25 years of experience of doing this.
Do you get a lot of calls from parents that, hey, I'm noticing something in my child? District hasn't said anything, but the parent just comes out and says, I want to know what's going on. Maybe with a child that's not even on an IEP yet, or maybe is never on an IEP, but I want to know what's going on. Do you get calls like that?
Yeah, probably about a third of the calls I get, I don't end up seeing the child. And sometimes it's because it's too early. Like I was saying with the 5-year-old that isn't fully reading yet, some of their expectations may just be a little bit off developmentally. And sometimes it's, because they haven't tried some obvious things first. And so the first meeting is really just to see if testing is going to be helpful to them. It may be that the first step is to have them work with a therapist if they're dealing with some anxiety, or they've just, adjusted to a new school, or maybe they just need, a buddy to work with them at lunch, or, something relatively mild, and testing is going to be way overkill. And so I have a lot of kids where, or maybe they don't need an IEP at all. They need a 504 plan that provides some basic accommodations, or a student study team meeting. So I don't assume that they need testing to start with. That I kind of, again, I look at it as if this were my child, it's a lot of time and money. You don't want to put all that effort in if the child doesn't really need it, and if there's other steps you can take first. And then once they've taken those steps, then and things still aren't working, then it's probably worth going forward and doing testing.
Got it. So it sounds like you have an initial meeting where you sort of get a background and get a feel for whether you're needed, right, to take the next step, which is a full assessment. Do you sometimes do partial assessments as opposed to full ones?
I don't do partial assessments just because I find that that's most of the time when I'm brought in to do a second opinion, the reason the first opinion missed something was because they did either a partial assessment or they drew conclusions without doing an assessment at all. And there's such an interplay of things. You can have a child who is really anxious and they look like they have a reading issue, but really they just don't like reading out loud. Or you get a kid who is really depressed that looks like they have an attention problem, but then you look at their history and they never had an attention problem before, and all of a sudden at age 12 they have these massive issues with attention. So there's such an interplay between intellectual abilities, academic skills, attention, anxiety, depression, that if you don't see the full picture, then you're going to miss something. The other thing is that parents sometimes come in and they want an evaluation of one thing, but it's always what the child does poorly. So it's like I also don't want a report that's really negative. I want a report that says they're really smart, they're really hardworking, they're creative, they're great at math, but they're also struggling with reading. So it's balanced and fair to the child and helps the teacher to know what strengths to work with, and also what they need to work on and develop a little bit more. I don't want a report that is just showing all the negative or all the positive.
No, that makes perfect sense. And just to give a little context to your second opinion reference there, I don't know how or who's listening, but for the audience, sometimes we'll use a licensed psychologist to give a second opinion to what the district just reported. For many of you, you will have already been assessed by a school district, typically a school psychologist, and various other speech therapists, occupational therapists, maybe even a mental health assessment. And then what the law says, and this is the IDEA, the overriding federal law that we all operate under, or all the attorneys, that is, what it says is if you don't like the district assessment and you disagree with it, you can request what's called an IEE, an independent education evaluation. And I'm assuming that that's what you're talking about, Dr. Pratt, when you talk about a second opinion. Typically, it comes under that scenario.
Yeah, although if a family said that, I would say it's not really not liking it. It's really they did something wrong. There's something where the evaluation isn't appropriate. So that is one of the things that I'm looking at, is reading the district's report and looking for, did they miss something? And like I said, some school psychologists do excellent reports. They're very thorough. They do a reasonable amount of testing. They clearly reviewed the records and so on.
No,
and other ones miss something, that, I'll give an example. I had a family that came in, and the school psychologist had assumed that all of the issues were due to English as a second language, and did not qualify them as having a language disorder or a learning disability because they assumed everything was English as a second language. That assumption turned out to be because of the last name of the family sounded Hispanic.
Right.
Then when I just spent 5 minutes with the family, it was very clear that English was the only language that they spoke. This child had had all their education in English, and that assumption had changed all the data. So I try and look for, should they have done more? Are there things they should have considered more? Is there more testing they should have done, and so forth? Because it's if they did a really good evaluation, they don't really need me to do a second opinion. So the second opinions, it's usually when there's something glaringly wrong with the first opinion.
Agreed. And the district, when they do theirs, they have to do it the right way. It has to be appropriate. They have to use enough of the testing. It's called child find, to make sure that they uncover all the potential learning disabilities and challenges. But the law says it a little differently. The parents, just so the listeners understand, in order to request an IEE, all you have to say is that you, quote, disagree, unquote, with the district's report. You do not have to detail why, right? Because you're a parent and you don't know why. You just know it doesn't fit your kid, right? Many of my clients will read it and go, they missed this, this, and this, or I'll read it and go, man, they didn't follow the manual here, there, and everywhere else, and it really didn't capture student. Yeah. But from a parent's perspective, all they have to do to request an IEE is tell the district they disagree. They do not have to, from a parent's perspective, give details as to why they disagree. Yeah, so that's why I use that term. Just so the
reason that I was commenting on the not liking is I do have some parents, and this is one of the difficult parts of my job. Right. I do have some parents that they don't really want to hear the truth. And right. there are some evaluation results that are really difficult to hear as a parent. If you have an 18-year-old and the diagnosis is schizophrenia, that's going to be understandably difficult for any family to hear. Yeah. And so there are some times when the school is right, even though the parents don't like the results. And then when I do an evaluation, I'm not trying to get at what the parents want to hear. I'm trying to get at what the truth is and what's really going on. And sometimes I agree with the parents in certain areas, and I agree with the district in other areas, and I just have to go where the data, leads me.
And which is exactly why I've enjoyed using you in the past. When you've been involved in my cases, I know I've got a straight shooter. I know I've got somebody who's going to give me the truth. I'm going to understand that child far better than I did before, and that your recommendations are very likely going to head us right in the right direction, whether my clients like it or not. And very often they're not thrilled with the direction that you give them, but they are down the road, right? Because there's nothing more important from my perspective, right? Knowledge is power. Knowing your child, knowing what they're dealing with, and then putting together a program that focuses on those challenges properly, right, and appropriately, so we see progress. Well, a question that stands out for me is what are some of the most challenging kids that you deal with? Because they're all different, right? Every single one of them is different. What are the ones that have proven to be most challenging?
I got to tell you, most times it's not the kids that are challenging.
Yeah.
So I mean, one of the things that I love about working with kids is kids tend to tell you exactly what they think, whether or not you want to hear it, and so they're very genuine. They're doing their best. Most of the kids that I see, even if they're really struggling with things, they're genuinely trying. And every once in a while, you'll get a child who's really oppositional, but the vast majority of kids, even if they're violating some social norm or whatever, it's that they haven't learned those skills yet. And so I want to help them learn whatever it is, how to deal with frustration, how to deal with anxiety, how to understand other people's perspective and social interactions, and so on. So for kids, I really enjoy most of that interaction. The hardest kids to deal with are the ones that just completely refuse to do testing, where, every once in a while, and it happens about once a year, you'll get a 17-year-old that's just like, I'm not doing it no matter what. And there's really not a lot I can do about that, because it's not just that they need to be cooperative, they need to actually try. So if they put in minimal effort, you're going to get an underestimate of their IQ, an underestimate of their processing speed, and the report's not going to be as helpful. So, but more often the challenging thing is all of the adults getting along and coming to an agreement about what the child's needs are. That's really more where my stress comes from in my job, is getting the adults to be all on the same page.
Yeah, no, that's the important piece, right? I mean, that's the whole point of what you do, is trying to get everybody to understand what this child needs and get them on board with providing that service. What are some of the common mistakes you see, maybe that parents make in this process, and particularly in hiring and dealing with someone like you and getting through an IEP?
I would say probably the biggest mistake is not keeping good records. For example, not recording an IEP meeting, having informal conversations with the teacher that don't have any sort of written record, and then later on, when something goes wrong, they don't have any records to show what happened. So, for example, I know they need to give written notice ahead of time, but I always suggest they record the meetings. And one of the reasons that I record meetings, schools sometimes think that it's because there's conflict, but I record meetings even when everything's going great, because when I see that kid a year later, I listen to the previous IEP meeting, and then it's all fresh in my mind. And then I can say, okay, yeah, last year he was really struggling with this. This year he's doing much better, and so forth. So having a clear record, written record, auditory record of everything that's gone on is really helpful, because then you can both see progress and you can see where they haven't made progress. And so a lot of families, when things are going well, they don't keep any records, and then one year things go wrong, then all of a sudden they scramble to try and figure out what to do.
Yeah. No reason for you to know this, but any listener who has followed us from the beginning knows that is our number one rule. Record. For all those reasons. Very, very important. And if I had an 11th rule, it would be the same. That's how important it is. You solve a lot of problems by putting everything on the record. And then you're able to sift through that record and understand more fully what the child needs and the student needs to be successful in school.
Yeah, and the other reason for parents to record, I mean, I hate listening to someone talk and take notes at the same time, and it's very hard when I'm the one talking to also take notes.
Right.
So parents often end up with notes of everything other people said, but they don't have notes of what they said, which, then if it doesn't make it into the minutes, they don't have any way to correct it. So,
Yeah.
And meetings can be really overwhelming for families. You might have 20 people there and they're all talking about your child and they're all using all sorts of jargon and abbreviations you're not familiar with and so on. So I encourage parents to listen to the meeting afterward, maybe a week later, listen to it afterward and just make sure that they understood everything. They don't have any follow-up questions, so on. And then to make sure that the minutes from the meeting are accurate. There wasn't any key point or key agreement, or sometimes you'll discuss accommodations during the meeting, but they don't really make it onto the accommodations page. So it's helpful for parents unfamiliar with the process to go back, and especially if one of the parents doesn't come to the meeting. If one parent comes to the meeting, the other one doesn't, it's still nice for them to have some way to see, what happened, because they're still involved in making decisions in their child's life.
Right. And again, for those listeners who have followed along from the beginning, we talk about a parent addendum at the end of my 10 rules that allows you to put on the written record various corrections, if you will, to the minutes or the district's notes. Right. So, two things that stand out is every once in a while, it's not very common, but if it happens, you have to correct it. And that is the district references something in the note that didn't happen at the meeting. Nobody said that, or what was said was really meant to say something completely different. And the way it was written in the notes suggests an entirely different outcome. You have to fix that. And you have to do it in writing. And we use what's called a parent addendum to do that. And then, of course, to Dr. Pratt's point, what's very common is that you've got a 3-hour meeting and it's reduced to 2 pages of notes, and there's an awful lot missing there. And you want to make sure that it's in writing what was said at that meeting that is supportive of what you're trying to convince that team is right for your child in terms of a service or support or a challenge, right? You want the record to be clear and accurate, and you can do that after an IEP, and it's so much easier to do if you record.
Yeah.
So recording is very important. Also, just to double back on something else you said, if you do have a verbal conversation, and we invite them, we want there to be teamwork. So we never tell any client, don't talk to a district person or the teacher, right? You want that. But if you get something in that discussion that is very important, memorialize it in an email, right? Put it on the written record so that everybody can take advantage of that conversation when the time is right. So all very important points. What do you enjoy most? What's the best part of? I know the best part for me.
There's two. One is kids' sense of humor. I get kids that laugh at test questions, you get all sorts of things where kids, just make turn everything into a game. And so I do really enjoy that. And then the other part is just watching progress. I have a lot of kids that I test them every 3 years. Yeah. And so I'll see them at age 7 and then 10 and then 13. And so, and now I've got kids where they were kids and now I'm testing their kids because it's 25 years later.
Oh,
so
is that right?
They now have a 7 or 8 year old who, is going through some of the same things that they were when I first met them. So, so I really enjoy, I really enjoy seeing the progress, and most of the kids that I see really do make good progress over time. So it's fun to see, and it's fun to see them get into college and get into grad school and so on. So
very similar response that I would give. There's something about, because when a child isn't doing well in school, is refusing school, is miserable in school, that whole family is miserable generally. And those parents don't know what to do. They're pulling their hair out, and nobody's stepping in to help in many circumstances. And when we're able to flip the switch on that, and the next thing you know, you've either have a different school and that child is very, very happy to go to school for the first time, or the same school, but you've changed the environment so that that child is gets up in the morning really excited about going to school for the first time in years, that changes that entire family's trajectory and emotional and mental health and the whole thing. That combination, because it really spreads out from that student. It isn't just that student that when we see significant progress that we're serving and or helping, right? It's that entire family, even the siblings. What else would you say? What advice would you give to parents? I mean, you've been doing this for a long time. From I understand. How long have you been doing it? First of all, that's a good question.
25 years.
25 years.
25th year, yeah.
Yeah.
What advice would I give families? I mean, a few different things. One is keep records for what's happened. Keep report cards and so on. And even if there's critical emails, like if you get an email from a teacher saying, I'm really concerned about his reading, he's a year behind the rest of the class or whatever. I mean, some of those emails can be critical later because they're recognizing when the first issues were noticed. Mm-hmm. Another one is for IEP meetings. It's really important to prepare ahead of time. You never have as much time as you think you're going to have. You don't, and so if you don't have a clear plan for what you want to accomplish. So I have parents that, they have a high school student, and when they get to the meeting, they start recounting what happened in kindergarten, what happened in first grade, what happened in second grade, and so on, as if they're going to go through the child's entire life history. And I'm like, each teacher you only have a snippet of their attention. And so I try and get them focused on, okay, what's the key thing in math? The key thing in math is that, they can't type math as well as they can do other things. So is there some support that can help with that? Can they get lecture notes? Is there a math app that can capture things? Or, so looking at kind of class by class, what is it that they're struggling with? And for the parents, just have a clear plan of here's what I want to accomplish at this meeting. And these 5 things, and often sharing that with the school ahead of time, or when you have the agenda, or when they have parent concerns at the beginning of the meeting, state what those things are, and then even if you don't get to everything, at least you've gotten to the most important things. Good. And a lot of parents, they kind of just look at the meeting as the school is reporting to them, but it's really both ways. It's the school reporting to them how the child is doing, but it's also them giving their input on the plan, because they're all equal team members.
No, that's great. And it sounds, I talk at length about that in the first 3 episodes, the importance of all of that. How about the parent who has a younger child starting to see things that are concerning, behaviors maybe, or just developmental delays? At what point would you tell a young family, all right, when you see this is probably a good time to check out a local licensed psychologist to do an assessment? Is there anything that stands out as, all right, here's probably the time you need to go see somebody, but if it's not there yet, you're probably okay. Let time play out and let development go where it goes until it gets to some point where it's clear that they need somebody like you. Is there any way to draw a line there to give our listeners some sense of whether they can relax a little bit or should go find somebody like you in their neighborhood sooner rather than later?
It's kind of a complicated question because it really varies. For just as an example, if you take ADHD and attention problems, pretty much every 4-year-old has attention problems. They're not going to sit down to an hour lecture and listen carefully and so forth and remember everything. They're not managing their own calendar and so on. So but if that same child isn't able to pay attention at age 10, then it's really going to hold them back. And so you really need to look at what is the skill versus what are the expectations at each age for a child. And same thing with anxiety. To have a little bit of stranger anxiety and a little bit of nervousness going to school and preschool and kindergarten, that's totally normal, and just some reassurance. They don't necessarily need therapy. They just need to get used to a school environment. So in those cases, when it's developmentally normal, then I might give some the parents some advice on how to handle it and how to manage it. But they don't necessarily need an intervention. They don't necessarily need an IEP or testing and so on. So it's really when whatever it is that's expected that the child is doing is completely, out of whack with their developmental level. There's other times, though, when the issues are so severe that you need to intervene right away. So, for example, if you have a child who's so impulsive, say at age 6, that they're running out in the street, or that they're dangerous or running out of the classroom or off campus or whatever, you're going to need to intervene. Even if some level of impulsivity is expected, you're still going to need to intervene just for their safety. So I'm looking at, is this a typical thing given their age? What are the downsides of postponing treatment? What's the risk, and how effective is treatment at that age? Because that's the other thing with learning disabilities, for example. If you're doing really intensive exposure when the child is too young to be able to benefit from it, it's sort of wasted effort. And early on, it might be better to just read to them and get them to enjoy reading, rather than doing it a really intensive reading remediation program that they're not ready for.
Right.
So it's gauging each child depending on what the issues are and what the risks are.
Yeah, no, that was a complicated question. Do you diagnose on top of everything else?
Yes. Yeah. So I mean, diagnosis is critical for a bunch of reasons. And I tell families, there's a couple different reasons to do testing. One of them is clinical, which is to really figure out what's going on with the child, how to help, and so forth. The other is kind of bureaucratic. And the bureaucratic thing is, maybe the child's taking the SAT and they need extended time on the SAT. And in order to do that, they need to have a diagnosis. They need to have, something that shows that there's a substantial disability, and so forth. So sometimes you need testing just to understand your child, even if you don't share the report with everybody. But other times you need it to, because you're applying to a certain learning disabilities program, or because you're asking for a certain accommodation, and then you need that to be able to get that service or accommodation. So there's various reasons to do testing, and like I said at the beginning, sometimes there isn't a reason to do testing. Like I have where a parent will come in and say, my child's really depressed, and they're but they haven't done anything yet. They're not in therapy. They're not on medications. They've done nothing. And I'm like, I don't know that testing is the first step. Let's start with trying to get them some support, make sure that they're safe, and so on, because testing takes a while. So if they're potentially suicidal or whatever, I don't want to be dragging them into a long testing process until they have the urgent support that they need. And then once they have that urgent part taken care of, then we can decide, are we gonna do a more thorough evaluation?
No, very good. How does my audience get a hold of you?
So I mean, my website is just prattcenter.com, prattcenter.com. And then they can just email me at info@prattcenter.com. And there's a lot of information on my website about kind of the testing process. It can be a little overwhelming because, like I said, I want families to gather all the records. I observe in the classroom and interview the teachers and do all the testing sessions and so on. So there can be a lot involved, but the website has a lot of it because they could schedule appointments online and figure out exactly what they're getting into. So.
No, that's great. And I will just say to the audience, again, the nice thing about working with Dr. Pratt when I have the opportunity to do so is he's very thorough. He probably underestimated himself there earlier when he said that. And so what you get is a very complete picture, and that can be very useful. And also, I don't know where you are when you're listening to this, but there are many licensed psychologists who perform the same role that Dr. Pratt does. Hopefully somebody very close in your community, and hopefully somebody as thorough as Dr. Pratt. If so, find those people and consider having your child assessed, and then bringing that assessor to the IEP with you, the next one, to talk through a report, summarize the data, and be there to assist if that person and you agree on what is needed to drive progress with your child. Hopefully then with that combination, you'll be able to get the district to provide that service. And in many cases, when everybody agrees a support or service is needed, it does help. And in many cases, considerably. We have a lot of clients, obviously, that come into our office with zero progress in many different areas for their kids over a very long period of time. Nobody picks up the phone and calls an attorney when, their kid, has one bad test. It's usually a long period of really a lot of struggles and very little, if any, progress. So when you get there, you need an expert, right? That's the point of the message here, is that you need somebody with credentials like Dr. Pratt who can come and help you not only understand your child's challenges, but also help you if everyone is in agreement to drive the service and support that really allows your child to make progress in school. That's what this is all about. So with that, thank you, Dr. Pratt, very much for joining us. Very helpful to our audience, I'm sure. And that will do it for this episode of Special Education Essentials. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I am your host, David Tollner. We will see you hopefully next time when we'll have another specialty school, a director of a specialty school called Fusion Academy. It's a one-on-one program here in Northern California, but also they have 80 schools throughout the nation. That's why I really wanted to have them on, because if you're listening to this in other states, hopefully there's a Fusion near you, and it may very well be a nice program for your child, depending upon their learning disability. All right, with that, thank you again for listening. Thank you again, Dr. Pratt, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
You've been tuning in to the Special Education Essentials for Parents and Families podcast with your host, David Tollner. This podcast is not intended as legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Please talk to your legal counsel about your own situation. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and on our website, tollnerlawoffices.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.